Hello plant friends. So as I was going around looking at specimens I have for today's video, I found this. Right, so this is a cutting of a variegated Monstera. I have it rooting in water, and today I saw it and I found this. So I hope it focuses. There is a clear demarcation in coloration between this darker area over here and the healthy looking stem here. If I touch it, it's it's quite mushy, right? So obviously this area has been rotted. So I am going to deal with it right now. All right, so I have my paring knife from the kitchen, and I'm just going to cut this part off. For those of you guys who are just joining us, my name is Jimmy. I'm a doctor and tropical plant hobbyist here in LA. And for those who are, returning, my name is still Jimmy. So here's the old part, and then I chopped it off. What I want to make sure is that this darkened color is not, has not penetrated up to the area that I want to keep and stay healthy, right? So I'm pretty generous with the amount of stem that I cut off so that I can assure that the rot that is penetrating and infesting this part is not going to infest and penetrate this part. All right. So sometimes the outer discoloration is going to be less than the amount of rot that's actually inside and in the center of the stem. Okay. So sometimes, even though you're cutting off this, the center of the stem in here is still going to be dark and discolored. So that means that you will have to chop it off a little bit more. You need to make a sharp cut. I think that is the most important thing that you need to do. Okay? You need to make a sharp cut. So you have to pick your sharpest knife. If you have a pair of really sharp scissors or shears, you can use that too, but I highly recommend a knife. So why? I'm just going to put this down. So think about the last time you bumped into something, right? Like you were walking around and either you bumped your arm or you bumped your leg or your toe into something, and then a few days later you notice a bruise, right? So if you think back about all the bruises that you've had and remember the bump that caused the bruise, you will probably remember that the area of the bruise is much larger and bigger than whatever, contact bump that caused that bruise, right? So the reason for that is that, when you're bumping to something, you're causing what we call a crush injury, right? So that the area of the maximum impact, direct impact, is crushed, right? But also the area around it is also crushed, right? So that area is damaged tissue. So how does that apply to cutting something? We've probably all seen infomercials about knives, right? Like they always compare a really sharp knife with a really dull knife, and I think the key test is cutting a tomato, right? So you see a really sharp knife that just right slices through the tomato, whereas a dull knife, it's right, it crushes the tomato, right? So in terms of cooking and tomatoes, right, you're gonna eat it anyway, so I assume it's just a presentation issue, right? But for plants and also in medicine, we want to avoid crushing injury as much as we can. So when you have a fresh cut like this, the area that you cut, as all this new fresh tissue, this area is exposed, right? It's susceptible to it's already injured, right? This layer of, is already injured. It's susceptible to rot and bacteria, right? So it's highly susceptible to rot as it is. But when you're using a blunt instrument and you're creating layers and layers of crushed tissues behind that, you're increasing the amount of damaged tissue and susceptible tissue in this area, right? So it's really, really important that you try to use the sharpest instrument that you can, so that you make the, you know, the cut that is least damaging and preserves as much healthy tissue as you can. See, I also try to cut it perpendicular, or, you know, at a 90-degree angle, so to reduce the surface area that is exposed. I know that a lot of people focus on, you know, sanitation and being as sterile as possible, like they would, you know, use, yeah, all sorts of things. I don't do it when I'm potting. I don't wear gloves when I'm potting. I don't, you know, use alcohol swabs for sterilization. And the reason why I don't do it is that I don't believe it has a benefit, and I have not been convinced in any way that there is a benefit to doing it. One of the main reasons is that there's bacteria everywhere, right? There's bacteria in the air, there's bacteria on us, there's bacteria on every surface, on every plant, right? A lot of that bacteria is either what we call healthy, or I guess I would call like neutral bacteria, right? Bacteria that doesn't do anything. It just lives around and with us, and it doesn't cause us harm, it doesn't cause our plants harm, it's just there. That's much different from the bacteria that we're all afraid of, right? We're all afraid of that bacteria that causes a root rot, right? Especially when we're talking about propagating and rooting cuttings and plants. We're afraid of root rot, but the bad bacteria that causes root rot is not the bacteria that's floating around. It's not the bacteria that's living on surfaces, living on you, me, living on the plants, right? We're talking about different types of bacteria. And then the other reason is that, you know, regardless of what you do, your gloves, your alcohol, you're not going to be able to eliminate everything, right? You're never as clean and sterile as you think you are. So that's why I don't do it. If you are one of those people who are really into, like, you know, swabbing and wiping everything down and using gloves when you're gardening or propagating, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think that there's a harm in doing it, but I also don't think that there is as big a benefit as a lot of people who do it make it out to seem. All right, okay, so anyways, this is supposed to be and is going to be a propagating and rooting video, okay, an episode, all right? So I guess let's start. So I did pick out a couple rooting specimens for you guys, for us to talk about today. So they are both variegated elbow cuttings. So here are my two ones, and as you can see, they are already developing some roots. I think both of these have been in water for, I would say, almost a month now. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this guy, and then so we're gonna start with very, very basic stuff, and also, as you can see, this guy has some rot down there too, which, since I'm at it, in case I don't want to forget, I'm just going to cut it off now as well. Okay. All right, great. This one also has a very, very clean center. When we're talking about the node is the most important thing you want to consider, right? The node is where the roots are going to come from. The nodes are where the new branches and leaves are going to come from, right? So you want nodes. You want as many nodes and as many healthy nodes as you can. So so this one, I have one node. I did have another node here. You can tell that even without knowing that I cut off a piece, that there was a node here. And you can tell because, there's some roots coming out here. Obviously, the node got a little rotted, so to preserve the rest of the cutting and this plant, I cut off that node. That means that the only place there's a node here, sorry. So that means that the only place new branches and new leaves are going to come out of are here and here. Right? That means that even though I have roots come here, if this area got damaged, right, it can get damaged. I have a lot of leeway coming up here, right? So I can keep chopping if I really had to, and I would still, this node should still stay healthy, and this node should still stay healthy, right? So even if rot penetrated up, I have a lot of leeway. Normally, a cutting implies that there are no roots. Right? Sometimes you have, like leafless cuttings as well. So in that case, you only have an area of node and like some stem, but no roots and no leaves. If your plant doesn't have roots, it doesn't get more water. If your plant doesn't have leaves, it doesn't create more energy, right? I suspect there is some energy generation from the stem, especially if the stem has a lot of green. There is some photosynthesis going on there. I don't think it's that much, but I honestly don't know. I can't give you a percentage. But in general, again, right? Leaves, you need leaves for energy. You need roots for hydration, right? So, and you're like, of course, right? You're like, I don't need you to tell me that. I can ask my 5-year-old, or basically any 5-year-old walking around or staying at home in these cases, right? You can ask anyone and they know that yes, leaves provide energy, roots provide water. We know the two facts, but I think we're forgetting what the implications are. So what are the implications? The implication is that if you have no roots to provide water, that means that your plant, over time, every second, every minute, every hour, day, weeks, months, is getting more and more dehydrated. So when you have no roots, your plant is on a clock, right? The longer it is without roots, the closer it is to just dying and drying out from dehydration. Right? So there are things that you can sort of do to buy yourself more time, right? You can get a cutting that is freshly cut, right? That's already like maximally hydrated before, so then you have like a longer clock. A lot of people promote keeping your cuttings in a more humid environment, right? I think that, I don't know how much it helps, but logically, and reasonably, it probably does. It probably buys you a little bit more time, so that like your plant is not losing water as rapidly when it's in a humid environment. No leaves. Wait, what does that mean? That means you're also on a clock, right? That means that without leaves providing more and more energy to your plant is only living on reserves, right? It's living on stored energy that's in your cutting, right? That's like in the node, in the stem, right? So you're on a water clock and you're on an energy clock. It means that you probably benefit from a larger specimen, right? Like if you were buying just the stem, you probably benefit from a larger cutting, right? A larger cutting likely has more energy in it and also more water stored in it than a super, super tiny cutting. And so what do you need the energy for? You need the energy for everything, right? You need the energy to make more roots, right? You need the energy to make I think there's like a little bud here for more stems and more leaves, right? So you need some energy in there, and probably you need quite a bit of energy in there for your plant to turn from a cutting to a healthy plant. So the next thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the roots. Okay, so you can see that up here there was an area root, and then there's like some new area roots growing, right? And then down here you see fresh water roots, right? Roots that, you know, this thing has been propagating in water, so these are the new roots. Okay, and the new roots are the white roots, right? The old root was this big dark root. And this big dark root used to be an aerial root, right? It used to be an area root. Now, after I plopped it in water for a while, these new water roots came out, right? So area root, water root. Neither of these are soil roots. Okay, so that means that like this area root grew and is accustomed to air, right? So that means it's not accustomed to soil. So when you put it in soil, you put it in a moist media, the area roots are extremely likely to rot, right? Because it's not used to being surrounded by moisture, right? These water roots, the water roots are used to being exposed to and being in moisture, right? They're water roots, right? But these are not exposed or used to and exposed to bacteria that naturally grows in the soil, right? So when you put these water roots into the soil, one is that some of them are going to dry out, right? Some of them just like, okay, there's not enough water. I'm used to water. I'm just going to dry out. Right? That's if you used a well-draining and airy soil, right? Some of these roots will sort of just dry out. The other is that if your soil is too moist, it retains too much water. These are one of the first roots to to get rotted, right? So you're going to lose some to drying out. You're going to lose some to rot. How long should I leave this cutting in water for? If you're water rooting like I do. Right? A lot of people are like, is this thing ready to go to soil? I would say that depends, right? That depends on what your mixture composition is like. That depends on how comfortable you are. But I think the main question is, well, let's say like if you lose a third of these roots to dehydration, right, or drying up, or to some form of rot, do you feel comfortable? I feel like right now for this guy, I think a lot of people would probably say no, right? A lot of people would be like, just sort of wait, right? And especially if you're thinking, if I lost like a third of these roots, that would make a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. All right, guys. So let's do a little short recap and a close-up of this plant. So here we go, aerial root, right? This is the node, and you see this is a bud, probably a new stem coming out of this one. This was where the other cutting, or where the plant was chopped off from the top. And as you can see, from where you chopped it off to where it actually dries up, there is a distance there, right? So that's why I tell you guys, you want to make as sharp a cut as possible so that this area of damage and recovery is as minimal as possible, right? And the good thing is that it's quite a bit a ways from the node, so that's good. Moving down, this was like an old aerial root that now has a little root here, and then you can see this. We have like a little bud coming out of here, and it looks good. If you look at it, right, it looks the bud looks pretty good. And so our second node, and then down here, I'm filming this the day after I cut it. So let's see if you guys can see the center. It's a little, there we go. You can see it right there. The middle part looks, it's drying out, but it doesn't look like it's dark color indicative of rot. So it's a good clean cutting. So all the rot, has been cut away. So the center of this one looks really clean. The cut itself looks really clean. When you see, if you're cutting with a blunt instrument or blunt scissors or knives, you'll see that there's there's like a cupping, I suppose, and it's not as clean as what you see here. If you compare the roots on this one compared to yesterday we saw a lot of white roots, right? And you can see that just being overnight in air, and obviously I did that to let this area callus. You can see that a lot of the roots have dried up. I'm hoping that the light shows through, but yeah, right, lots of areas of being dried up. So you can imagine that once your plant that has been accustomed to water gets transitioned to soil, this is what happens. This is like some of the roots will dry up, right? But you'll still have some sustainable roots to help carry you through and transition to soil. But as you can see, quite a bit of the whiteness we saw yesterday has gone, and towards the tips, these smaller roots for sure basically they're a bit gone. So I am going to put this guy back in water anyway. I probably took half a step back or something with the roots, but it is what it is, right? You kind of have to deal with root rot above all else. Let's switch it up because I think you guys have seen a lot of this one. Let's switch it up to this guy. Okay, so what do we want to talk about for this guy? So when I'm buying a cutting or I'm seeing a cutting like this for sale, I would say this is a really good cutting. One is that I do like the variegation, right? So you want a cutting that has a pattern or variegation that you like or comfortable with and speaks to you. So I like that. When I look at the stem, I know I can count one node, 2 nodes, 3 nodes, 4 nodes, and like five nodes. So 5 nodes. That means that I have 5 chances for this guy to root, right? So for new roots to come out. That means that like if this one gets lost to root rot, okay, I have 4. If this one gets lost to root rot, 3, right? So I have multiple chances in case things go wrong. And you should always assume that something will go wrong. I think when you're investing money and if you're investing money in something and everything has to go right for that investment to pay off, I consider that a very risky investment, right? You want to invest in something where like even if something goes wrong, you'll still be okay most of the time. Yeah, so I have leaves in this cutting still. I have plenty of nodes. I would say it's a good sized cutting. There are already some roots, right? Even if I didn't have the water roots, there are already some roots. So that means that, again, when we're going back and we're talking about the amount of time this cutting has or the ticking clock, right? I would say I'm very comfortable with the amount of time that this cutting will likely survive than compared to some other cuttings out there, right? So I have leaves to give this plant energy. I have some roots to give it at least some moisture, right? And then I have plenty of nodes for this plant to get more roots and to start budding leaves, right? So I basically in this cutting, I basically have everything I'm looking for. This cutting has basically everything it needs with a lot of potential and a very high likelihood of successful propagating and maturing, right? Okay, all right. I often get asked, is there anything that I put into the water when I'm rooting in water? I use this. It's basically just cheap rooting hormone. You can find it pretty much anywhere. I believe this thing runs less than $10, and every time you use it, you don't use that much at all. So, a small container like this will last you quite a while. I can't tell you that I'm absolutely sure it works, but I feel that the potential benefits outweigh the risks, right? Like, I really don't think that using something like rooting hormone is risky to your plant. So because the potential benefit outweighs the risk and it's at a good price point, I use it. But I don't think this is something that's essential, even though I do use it. Okay, so let's look at this second specimen. This was the larger specimen with 3 leaves. So this one, right, I also cut off yesterday, and you can see that the edge is a little dry. So that's good, right? So being dry is good. And also for this guy, right, you can see that the really white roots, shiny roots, has started to darken at the tips, right? They've dried off because they're water roots and they're fragile and they are not used to being out of water. But at some point they will kind of have to figure it out. This is what happens under the soil or under the moss when you transition your cutting outside of water. You have to just anticipate that you'll lose some roots. So that's why you really want a good, robust root system before you transition out of water, unless you really, really need to do it for one reason or another. A lot of people ask me how often I change my water. I do it every week to 2 weeks. The reason why I promote changing the water, and I think the reason why a lot of people promote changing the water, is that you want to aerate the water. Stagnant water over time loses the oxygen. And in an area with less oxygen, that means that the bad bacteria that's going to cause your root rot has a better chance of surviving and thriving. For those who are curious about what I water with, I just use tap water. It just goes straight from the faucet into the water containers where I'm rooting my plants. So I don't, leave it out. I don't use distilled. I don't even filter it. I just let it be. Just regular tap water. I'll show you the container that I have. It's just it's just something like this, and I plop it in. I think that I know that some people use aerators, right? If you look in like a fish tank and you see that thing that makes the bubbles, I think that's actually a really good idea. I'm too sort of been like a little bit lazy to do it, but I think that if that's something that you can do, I think those aerators, those bubble makers, are pretty cheap, and they aerate the air. Or they aerate the water. They add more oxygen content to the water. So I think that those probably help. And if you do that, you probably don't need to change your water, all that often. So if you're thinking about like what can help you, what can benefit your process of rooting in water, I think that that aerator is probably the thing that I would recommend the most. I know that there are a lot of discussions about what type of media to propagate and root plants in, especially regards to Monstera and Philodendron and other aroids. I've always been a big fan of water just because I can see what's going on. Like the root rot that I discovered today. Right? I basically just, it was very easy for me to just like look into the water container and, saw that there was some discoloration, and it was very easy for me to take it out, cut off that piece, and then either aerate this piece out overnight to let it callus or put it back in water. I know that some people like rooting in moss, and I think that's also a very, very successful approach, and I don't have anything against that. I know that a lot of people also root in perlite, or primarily perlite or some perlite equivalent. Basically very airy, well draining, slightly moist mixtures. So if you like that, that works perfectly well too. Again, the only reason I lean more towards water is that it's always really worked for me, and it's very easy for me to detect and catch root rot. So this is a cutting that is very obviously in moss. We will be talking a lot more about this cutting in the next episode. This cutting was originally in water, and then once enough roots developed, I put it in moss. Some people go directly to moss in all of their cuttings, and I think that's great. I think the one thing that I have to tell people when they're doing moss, especially for people who have tried moss in the past and failed, is that you really don't want your moss, super damp, super wet. And especially if you have damp, wet moss in a container that is not terracotta, like a plastic container or a ceramic or a glaze, right? Like any container that isn't terracotta, the moss tends to stay moist, at least in my environment, for a very, very long time. So this moss is in a terracotta pot, and I think, I'm not sure if you can hear it, it's already pretty dry. So I water this every 2 weeks, and it's been about a week out already. So this guy is going to get its next watering in 1 week. And as you can see, it's already pretty darn dry. So if you're thinking about doing moss for your propagation, that's definitely a very viable and good option. Just make sure that you have the right conditions where the moss doesn't get super wet and damp and stay that way for a long time. What I tell people is that when you're feeling your moss, what you want to sort of do is that you want to like soak a handful underwater, or in your sink, and then squeeze the water out, right? And then when you do that, feel how moist and how damp the moss is. That is what you want to aim for. That's the ideal situation. It can be a little bit, a little wetter than that, but what roots really want, and your plant really wants, is that just some moisture around it, and it doesn't want to really sit in moisture or be in constant contact with moisture all the time, because that just promotes bad bacteria. All right, guys, I think that's going to be it for this episode. We are going to talk a lot more about this plant, the specimen in particular, in the next episode. We'll talk about what happens when you start budding and the implications of that. We also will talk about moving and transitioning your plant after the water rooting stage. So that's it for this one. Till next time, plant friends, happy planting.